You are small, wonderfully small.
I appreciate that.
Ladies, gentlemen, and Haradrim of all ages, Diablo 4's public beta is well underway, or at least the early access to the public beta is, and we on the channel have been playing it like crazy, just absorbing as much of this game as we can possibly get on every class currently available over the small amount of time we have. One of the big questions that I've seen come up in the community a lot is the concept of, quite simply, which class should you use? So today I'm going to break down the ones that we have in the beta, based both on their performance as far as sheer strength, but also just on their feel, how satisfying they are to play, and how well they match the class fantasy that they set out to reach. On top of this, I'll of course be talking about the Druid and the Necromancer 2, the two classes not currently in the beta until next week, but our information on those is comparatively limited as a result. Nonetheless, I felt they deserved a bit of time to just talk about what we can expect and what you are likely to experience with them when you can finally dive into them for yourselves, so that you can make a more informed decision about what class you want to play either at launch or even just at the proper public beta coming up next weekend, where we have access to everything and everyone can play. Starting off then, let's talk Barbarian. This is the one that I've played the most of myself. It's a classic warrior type of feel, and there are two main builds I've seen popping off so far in the beta. Of course, we are limited to level 25, which is relatively early game, but it still gives us an indication of what will be common at endgame, so you know how it will feel when we get there. For now, the two big ones are the Whirlwind focused build, where you power the hell out of Whirlwind and everything else just exists in the build for the sole purpose of making Whirlwind stronger. Buffs, fury generation, all of that, and this is your classic Diablo spin to win playstyle Barbarian, where you just hold down Whirlwind and spin through enemies having a blast while watching their health bar go slowly down. The other one, which I've come to like quite a bit more myself than Whirlwind, is the bleed focused build, which is new to Diablo 4. This one is a lot more powerful in the section of the game that we currently have, and the way that these skills synergize early on actually makes it extremely satisfying to use. The main idea behind it is applying various bleed effects to enemies to make them take damage over time, but as you stack up this damage over time, every tick of the bleed becomes absolutely massive, on top of which you have an ability to just pop your little blood boils and make all the bleed damage you've stacked up explode instantly, making this excel at both wave clear and boss damage in a way that is really fun to experience. So far with my time with this class, I've enjoyed it thoroughly. I think it requires a bit more thought in the early game section compared to some other classes, just because of the way that it's sort of built as a base. As one of the few pure melee classes, you sort of have to be right up in the middle of combat, which means it's a lot harder to dodge attacks from enemies, especially larger ones. That said, you also have a fair few more tankiness options. A big thing with Barbarian that makes it especially unique is that you actually have 4 weapons equipped at any given time thanks to the arsenal system, and depending on which you have on, you get different bonuses too, such as the two-handed sword converting a percentage of direct damage into bonus bleed damage, or the two-handed axe giving you more damage to vulnerable enemies, which is a status that we can proc quite easily as a Barbarian. As well, you can choose for each of your skills on your bar which weapon you want to use for that skill. The main reason that I think this will get even stronger with time is obviously those 4 weapon equipment slots. Each one of them can be a legendary, each one can have its own unique legendary effect, and so you simply have more slots for potential legendaries than any other class in the game does, meaning you have more room for growth later in the game. In early game though, this won't be in effect all that much. As far as power, most of the classes in the game are balanced pretty well, they just have their strengths and weaknesses. A Barbarian's strength is good defensive abilities and a ton of bleed, so much bleed, and it's quite strong. The weaknesses are that they need to be right in the middle of the fight to actually do any damage, and pretty much all damage that they do is physical, so any enemies that aren't really affected too much by physical damage, you won't be as good against. Also, their mobility is a little bit limited. It exists, it's just a bit limited. All in all, if you like the class fantasy of swinging around 4 different weapons and just being a walking catastrophe flinging metal everywhere, then this class will do great for you. Moving on then, we have our second class.
I'm a magic man.
The Sorcerer. This one is pretty obvious from the get-go. It's your classic fantasy mage, based around big, flashy elemental spells, and they all look gorgeous in Diablo 4. These are split into 3 categories: fire spells, which apply burn effects to deal damage over time, lightning spells, which are just big, nasty AoE attacks, and ice spells, which are heavy on CC, applying both slows and the frozen effect for a stun as well. All of this is very strong, and there's a fair amount of mixing and matching that you can do too. One big thing to talk about for Sorcerer is, of course, the ice armor. This is the main thing that lets you actually exist without being pummeled into the ground instantly with your squishy little health bar. This is a big icy shield effect, 6-second duration, 20-second cooldown, and it gives you a nice big barrier that gets even larger in relation to the damage that you do while it's active. On top of that, it increases your mana regen, which is massive because you will burn through mana like no tomorrow as a sorcerer, and one of the modifiers that it has lets you have a chance to freeze any enemy that hits you with it active for a super long time, which is fantastic too. And you also have various ways to make your ice armor active a lot more often than the cooldown would suggest. You can pretty much have it active most of the time. The offensive spells, seeing the most use for sorcerer right now, are Chain Lightning, which is literally just a lightning bolt that bounces between enemies doing loads of damage, and it can even bounce off of your own character if you're only fighting a singular enemy. But this one is much more than anything incredible for area of effect, wave clearing type shenanigans, and it will likely be your go-to for that. Then we have Hydra, which is arguably the best single target spell that you have, and also still pretty good for AoE, creating a little Hydra on the ground that spits fire out of each of its 3 heads and lasts for 12 seconds. There are ways to have more heads on the Hydra and give it things like increased crit chance, so it's extremely solid. The common base attack seems to be Frostbolt. It's not crazy, but it does solid damage. It has crazy CC, applying chilled and frozen to enemies as you hit them repeatedly, and on top of that there's an enhancement that makes it actively regenerate mana as you use it, which is fantastic for obvious reasons too. Basically, this class is really straightforward. It does what it says on the tin, and it does that extremely well. The only real weakness of Sorcerer is that it can run out of mana extremely quickly if you aren't careful, and outside of ice armor you are pretty squishy. But the strength is that it has silly damage potential and a great amount of variety within its spells, allowing you to easily CC, wave clear, and also run down bosses, all with skills that synergize together with each other wonderfully. If you want to be a wizard, this is the one for you, and it's performing quite well in the early levels as well. Third up then, let's talk Rogue, and Rogue is quite an interesting one, as realistically, there are 2 separate playstyles that don't really mix or mingle with each other, and these are a more melee-focused build with imbuements and tons of AoE, and a more ranged build which lets you stay further from the fight while also doing tons of damage. Rogue's bow skills tend to be stronger before you consider things like legendaries or secondary effects, especially as it lets you stay further away from enemies as you have the least defensive options for any class in the game. Essentially, you're just relying on your own ability to dodge attacks manually. The bow playstyle has lots of options, things like piercing shots or barrages of arrows, and the melee side of things is quite interesting too. Early on this tends to do less damage than the bow builds, but if you put something together well, the melee stuff can reach even higher potential. Specifically, there's a really fun build based around twisting blades and loads of movement. Twisting blades has you plunge your daggers into an enemy, then they fly back out of the enemy and back to you after a short delay. When they do this, they damage everything in between you and that enemy, so you build around this, you give yourself loads of movement, teleport on top of your enemies, press twisting blades on the big one, dash away and let everything in between you get hit by the return of the blades. And on top of this, the Shadow Clone Ultimate, which just makes a clone do every action that you do at 60% effectiveness, and you're just flying around the battlefield doing loads of damage, staying incredibly mobile, which lets you avoid most attacks, and you've got your little buddy backing you up doing the exact same things right after you. On top of that, you can pretty permanently apply the vulnerable debuff to enemies, making them take a load more damage from all sources, not to mention that you can also build Rogue around traps and imbuements, like an effect that makes enemies explode after death when hit by your attacks, so you become an absolute menace, and this is just one of the varied ways to play the Rogue. If you like daggers, there's a great playstyle here for you. If you like bows and crossbows, there's a great playstyle here for you as well. And if you like the idea of placing down traps and dragging enemies into them, then there's that too. If this sounds fun to you and you like the idea of being super mobile to avoid damage rather than super tanky and taking it to the face, then Rogue is probably a great choice for you, not to mention it's performing extremely well too. Then moving on to the 2 that we know a little bit less about, let's start with the Edgelord. Yes, the Necromancer. We know very little about this one aside from it will likely work quite similar to Diablo 3's Necromancer. We know their focus will be, well, necromancy, and this boils down to 4 different playstyles in this game. One of them is just mass summoning, making an absolute army of followers and letting them do the damage for you. This is obviously quite safe, but it also requires some work to get going as it uses the corpses of your enemies as fuel to make more friends. Then there is the bone skills. These are much more physical damage based. There will be some defensive bone options too, just things that let you play a bit more in melee range. After that, we have blood skills, and those are all based around lifesteal and the idea of healing yourself while also pumping out good damage. And then there is also darkness, which is more of a typical damage over time type of playstyle, where you can just watch your enemies slowly burn away into nothingness from a distance. The Necromancer will also have the ability to customize their summons, which is pretty neat too, actually getting to choose various options that affect whether their minions are more on the tanky side or the damaging side, and they also get skeleton mages too, so your undead can cast their own magic. It's not just you. Necromancer Necromancer has the potential to be the most well-rounded class, and obviously the more work that you can make your summons do for you, the less danger that you are actually in personally, not to mention the blood spells to heal you back up. Necromancer is expected to be particularly strong, so we'll just have to see how it works out in the second beta weekend and beyond. Then finally today we have the Druid. Druids are a pretty unique class in this game, being mostly melee based but also having some ranged spellcasting options. Generally, Druid spells will be mixed between earth magic and storm magic, the earth type spells focusing most on defense and also closer range damage, whereas the storm will be more focused on knockbacks and also AoE damage. On top of this, the Druid has attacks that transform it into either a werewolf or a werebear, with the werewolf attacks being more of a focus on high attack speed melee hits, and the werebear more focused on singular larger hits and also a bit of tankiness too. On top of this, we have the general class mechanic of Druid known as Crushing Blow, and various skills will have different ability to proc Crushing Blow. When this procs, it deals damage to an enemy for a percentage of its total life, which for obvious reasons has incredible implications, especially as you hit further into the game and into the late to end game content, where every enemy that you see has a massive health pool. Overall, because of this mechanic, Druid is expected to be quite strong. It has a lot of potential variety. The only real weaknesses that we are worried about for Druid is its movement, as a lot of what they do requires them to be up in melee, and we know that they'll have decent defensive abilities too, but we haven't heard much on their actual mobility, and that can be quite rough to be melee in a game like this without many movement options. All in all, as far as the proper best class goes, it will basically depend on the type of activity that you're doing. Of course, personally, I'm firmly of the opinion that the best class is the one that you enjoy the most, as every class in Diablo 4 is theoretically quite well balanced. They are capable of all the same content, just in different ways. They feel different, and the class feel that gels with you is the one that you'll tend to do the best with. Aside from that, though, I would generally expect that Sorcerer has some of the highest potential in solo content, as it has less effects and options that actually help out the rest of their party, which means that they have more options that are specifically meant for their solo play. They have high burst potential with the fact that their mana starts full, good sustain and CC, good tankiness with ice armor, good mobility, and so Sorcerer will always be right at the top when it comes to actual pure strength. Aside from that, Rogue will probably excel at activities like PvP. There is a stealth mechanic on this class that doesn't seem overly strong in PvE content, but of course in PvP the ability to be invisible will be a massive thing to build around and actually take people off guard. I'd be surprised if there isn't a build going around for PvP after not very long where rogues just basically one-shot people out of stealth, then the fight's already over. To sum it up a bit then, all of the classes are good. Everything we've heard about Druid and Necromancer are also very good. Everything seems relatively well balanced, which is extremely important in a game like this, so at the end of the day, honestly just go with the class that feels most comfortable in your hands, the one that you enjoy playing the most. I hope you've enjoyed this more detailed breakdown of the 5 classes in Diablo 4, and I hope it helps you make decisions for your first or even second character to try out for the beta weekends that we have, or even helps with your decisions on launch day. Keep an eye out for more detailed individual class guides that we'll be making over the next week to prepare you for the second beta, and of course we'll be covering both Druid and Necromancer in far greater detail once we have access to them next weekend. Like if you like the video, subscribe and hit the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.